Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to the latest episode in our new series, Call My Supervisor, the PhD podcast for the School of Politics and Economics here at King's College London. In each episode, we'll be speaking to a doctoral candidate from one of our departments to pick their brains about all things PhD, from their research and ideas to their revelations and advice. We hope to offer a platform for those studying with us to showcase their work while offering invaluable insight into what life is like studying to become a doctor. If nothing else, we hope you finish up today having learned something you didn't know when you started it. My name is Daniel Mansfield. I am the Communications Officer for the School of Politics and Economics here at King's, and I'm pleased to introduce you to my co-host for this episode, Yahya El Said, an undergraduate studying BA Politics here at King's. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest for this episode, Nick Scott, a doctoral candidate studying with the Department of Political Economy. Welcome, Nick.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Nice to see you both and hear you both. Let's get to it.
Perfect. So without further ado, let's make a start. And the first question is you, Yahya.
All right, Nick, if you could please just introduce your research, give us the title and perhaps a brief overview.
Sure, yeah. So my research is, I guess the title of my, or working title, let's say, is Rethinking Identity After Brexit, an Analysis of English and European Identity in Post-Brexit England. It's centered in nationalism studies, or at least grounded in nationalism studies, within the broader political field of comparative politics. I guess there's some IR elements to it as well, just because the European Union is an IR entity as much as it is also a comparative political entity. So I'm kind of in a mixed bag of different disciplines or schools of thought. But yes, I'd say I'm grounded in nationalism studies, and identity politics as well features quite a bit. So my project, I guess in a very summary sort of way of looking at it, is how Brexit has affected conceptions of English and European identity in the UK, but more specifically a focus on England because of the voting results of the Brexit referendum. It was mainly, quote unquote, an English decision more so than a British decision. And also because of the timeline coupled with my supervisor's advice, they recommended I focus on a specific nation or national community, so England as opposed to the UK, just because of the limitations to a PhD project. So the 4 years as opposed to having 6 in the US or Canada, where I'm from, Canada. So yeah, and I'm using a mixed methods approach to my data collection. It's called Q method. So it's somewhat novel in political studies. It's not been used in the study of identity in England before, as far as I'm aware. It combines, I guess, like interviews. We can get into the details of it more, but interviews and responses with individuals who are participating in the study. They organize a set of 43 statements, and those statements are then reverse factor analyzed using some software that you can find online. And then those statements and the statements, the way they were sorted, then reflect that person's opinion on the subject at hand. So Brexit, English identity, and European identity. And from there, the results from all these different participants' interviews are factor analyzed, and hopefully we find some correlations, some matrices whereby we can extrapolate those results onto the broader English society and develop some more encompassing opinions that might be held within the population.
Just to delve a bit deeper into the intricacies of the research, you describe the Q method in your abstract as innovative. In what ways would you say that it is innovative, and how is it a shift away from research methods that have been used in the past to explore topics such as the one that you're covering?
Yeah, so traditionally, Q method has been used in health sciences, urban planning, and other disciplines or I guess research areas that have not been so much so political in the sense of looking at identity, political identities, cultural identities, but more of just opinions on how to maybe conduct a certain urban planning mission, or to view how patients have received care in a hospital vis-a-vis their experiences in another hospital, things like that. So I'm not suggesting it's completely novel in the sense that it hasn't been used in political science at all, but I was recommended to at least explore Q method by my primary supervisor, Professor Adam Fagan, here at King's. He said it would be really good in terms of its application in the context of my study, especially by way of using it to uncover the subjective viewpoints on a very topical issue, but also controversial issue, right? So people aren't, I mean, maybe now things have become a bit less innocuous and a bit easier to talk about. But initially, Brexit was such a convoluted issue that people were nervous, scared even about discussing their beliefs or how they voted on Brexit, because it could lead to receiving negative feedback in the workplace, jeopardizing certain relationships, things like that. So a great thing about Q Method is that it's completely anonymized, and by the nature of the anonymousness to it, individuals don't feel as threatened by it. So there may be the hopes are they're more likely to divulge more information to the researcher, i.e. me, and because of that, I'm able to then take the findings and extrapolate that onto the broader context. So it paints a more, I guess, grounded picture and a more realistic picture of how Brexit and English identity are actually viewed in England.
Like Brexit is this vast, monstrous thing, right? It's got so many strands to it, so many different areas that get people rolled up. There's trade, there's immigration, there's border issues, there's sovereignty, all of that stuff, right? So you're looking specifically at what sort of areas and why those sorts of areas?
I'm interested in looking at the identity aspects of it, because Brexit was and still is mainly discussed as this political economic phenomenon, in terms of the contributions that the UK made to the EU and getting out of the EU in order to control immigration. So actually policy and economic focuses have been almost paramount in the analyses that have been conducted of Brexit so far. And I'm interested in looking at an under-researched area of Brexit, so the identity aspect to it. And I think, again, because England was such a catalyst, or the English vote was such a catalyst behind Brexit, it's interesting to look at England as its own individual context as opposed to the British context, which is more generally researched. And English identity and English nationalism have been, I guess, put on the back burner for a lot of the main discussions that have involved looking at British politics. And I mean, the West Lothian question is obviously featured. It's come up in Parliament, in parliamentary discussions, as well as being an issue evident in canvassing of political areas and whatnot. But English identity, English nationalism only really manifests itself in football, right? Like the only time we see this notion of Englishness specifically instead of Britishness is when England's playing football against, let's say, Scotland in the World Cup or something like that, or Wales in this recent World Cup in Qatar. So yeah, Englishness is an under-realized and under-actualized identity, I think, and it's also becoming much more prominent now that we have these discussions of maybe the Union breaking up or Scottish secessionism. And I think it's very topical and very interesting. I also think that European identity has oftentimes been conflated with the EU. So I'm looking at how European identity might change in England now that there is no longer this conflated understanding of being European, in quotes, because Europeanness is now not defined, for the English at least, by membership of the EU. Like the UK and England more specifically is out. So, I mean, there's now a vacuum of space where Englishness and Europeanness might be more aligned than one thought. And that's something I think is definitely going to come forward more when there's discussions with a newer generation of potentially rejoining the EU, what it means to be European, and everything in between, really.
And just quickly there before I hand back to Yahya, will you give reference or look at all at the other nations of the UK? What's the approach?
So initially, I wanted to look at all four nations of the UK, and my supervisor said that that was a daunting task, and I think they said, sorry, taking on too much for a PhD project, especially because the field work that I'm doing involves going to 9 different regions of England, and to include Scotland, which is quite a ways north, and then Wales as well, and then Northern Ireland, a completely different geographic space as well, would just have been too much to take on in terms of finances, other resources, and just time overall. So they recommended I focus on England, again, because they were the catalyst behind the Brexit vote to leave the European Union. And also English identity is not nearly as discussed as Northern Irish identity in combination with Irish identity and then Scottish identity, because it's the whole secessionist movement as well. And Welsh and Englishness, I don't want to say they're the same thing, because they're absolutely not. And there are cries for Welsh independence as well. And I mean, there's obviously a nationalist party in Westminster Parliament too. But the Welsh and the English were more aligned on Brexit. So there's that small justification to focus on England there as opposed to Wales. And I think just focusing on one, not homogenous body, but a codified body, which is England, is just easier. And also, in terms of my own interest, I think my interests lie with England more so than the other nations, not because I'm disinterested in them, but because my dad was born in London. So I've grew up more so in an English household than a British household. Albeit my mom was born in Scotland, but she moved over to Canada when she was a baby. So she doesn't really have that same allegiance and cultural upbringing that my father did. So I grew up in a somewhat English household in Canada. So there's just more of a personal tie to England as well, not to disassociate with Scotland. I don't want to paint that picture. But yeah, I think yeah, that's the main two reasons why I'm focusing on England. And I do discuss in my literature review not only justification for the English focus, but also the history of the British European relationship, so the EU relationship, over time. And I do touch on Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and the opinions that these populations have held separately, independent of each other, and then the more broad British opinion that's been held too, and that's in consultation with Eurobarometer statistics, with reports conducted by various think tanks and other bodies like the UK government within Britain as well. So I do touch on it, but I use that as a justification for the English focus.
All right, just to touch on this idea of the conflation of English identity with European identity in the past, in a pre-Brexit world, there's a very large focus on the negative implications and consequences of Brexit, especially in liberal media, I would argue. Do you believe in the positive sense that this departure from the EU leaves room for an English personality to develop in the traditional sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my research when I conduct fieldwork, which will commence in a couple of months, might give you a better answer. But for now, I think it is, unfortunately, at least in my sense, I think Brexit was not the best decision. I think it's too harsh to say it was a mistake. Firstly, because we haven't really seen the lasting effects of it, and we won't know until much later on. But hindsight's a beautiful thing too, so we can judge Brexit by those new metrics as they develop later on in time. But for myself, I probably would say at least that as an opportunity to see the positive in Brexit, unless you're a Leave voter, and if that's how you voted, then that Brexit already would be a great decision for you and would be what you wanted. But if you were a Remainer and you could try and find some positive light on it, it does allow for British decisions to be made in Britain alone. There's no overarching body that will impose or dictate terms. So I guess that sovereignty, which is one of the main categories of, I guess, Brexit decision making that people elected on or voted for, does have more of a leg, let's say. I think now with the EU not being, I guess, domineering in maybe a Leave voters' eyes, the UK can pursue its own interests abroad. It can conduct trade agreements overseas with the Commonwealth, with other entities on its own terms. It doesn't need to consult the EU and the other 27 member states. It's free in that sense, but I also think it has damaged the UK reputationally, and I think it does make Britain substantially weaker overall in terms of its global image, but that can be recuperated. So if the UK develops a stronger relationship with the US again, or if the UK decides to, I guess, manifest this Commonwealth in a global Britain way, in quotes, and draw on greater ties with Australia, let's say, India, South Africa, Canada as well, then who knows? Because the UK has oftentimes been referred to as the special relationship with the US, having that and being this path, this bridge for the Americans to be involved in Europe, both in security terms, but also in economic agreements in terms of just day-to-day conversation. There's that hot button phone call to the White House and everything as well. So yeah, I don't know. It's too early to say, but I think there can be a positive spin on it. I don't think it is as bad as people made it out to be. Like a lot of pundits predicted it would be the downfall of the UK and we're somewhat catastrophist. I don't think it's panned out that way, but I think that Brexit has been damaging to the UK in the short term, but not severely as it was predicted to be. And I think later on we'll see if the UK can function independently of the EU in a prosperous manner.
All right, and just to add on to that, how do you feel about its implications in regard to the educational sector? I used to live in Budapest. That's where I attended high school. And in previous years, the UK used to be a hub for European students to kind of go off to university, get educated in the UK. It was seen as, a place in which academics can thrive for Europeans as well as British people, of course. But post-Brexit, in regard to the increase in price, now that European students have to pay international fees and so on, there's been a significant, or I would assume, because I don't have the research in front of me, of course, that there's been a significant decrease in the number of students from Europe who are now coming to the UK. Do you believe that this, in the long term, could pose issues in regard to, the relationships in general and the state of academia within the UK now that you don't have these European students coming in?
Yeah, I think cutting off ties in any way, shape, or form is going to be detrimental to relationships. So I don't think that European students will lose their love or interest in studying in London or even anywhere in the UK or England more specifically. I think that there will always be that draw because despite Brexit, UK institutions, along with a few continental European institutions and a few in Asia and Southeast Asia, and then the US, hold the majority of the highest rankings than any indices you look at, really. So that educational draw is still there. The unfortunate thing is that while the draw and accessibility were both there previously, accessibility is now being severely limited by Brexit for European students, especially in the financial sense. I think it is very, very unfortunate how high the tuition fees are now for European students seeking to study in the UK. And obviously Erasmus is now no longer an option as well. So that doesn't facilitate that easy switch over to a UK institution for a year, 2 years, or even for half a year for a semester, something like that. So I think that is problematic in terms of the relationships between students, between student bodies, between institutions as well. But I think the UK will always maintain that draw. I mean, like you have the reputation of like the University of London or Oxbridge, and those are institutions that have existed for eons now, right? I don't think that they'll lose their reputations or even have their reputations damaged because of Brexit. And I think also a lot of the time too, European students will recognize that for the most part, people who did attend universities or people with university educations, they almost universally voted to remain. So they won't feel as if they're not wanted, or they won't feel like they're entering like a Brexit institution, right? They'll be coming to a UK institution with the knowledge that for the most part, the people there voted to remain. And I don't think in general there was ever really this idea that like with opting out or like removing oneself as the UK did from the Erasmus system, that there would never be exchange students again or visiting students or permanent students who come to the UK to study. Like my PhD cohort is more European than it is British in the sense that there's more students from the European continent than there are from the UK. In my office, at least, I can't speak for the broader program. And then there's a few North Americans as well. So unfortunately, it will become harder to navigate those fees, and hopefully there will be more funding allocated to international students by the UK government to incentivize foreign students to bring their knowledge base over here. I mean, we'll see again. It does depend on who's in government and where the money comes from. But yeah, I think those relationships will be maintained despite Brexit.
So you mentioned earlier that you were looking to do some field work, that you were engaging in some mixed methods for your research. Can you tell us a bit more about what you'll be doing? Are you going out on the road there? Have you got some interviews planned, for example?
Yeah, so again, Q method is what I'm utilizing as my like data collection and research methodology. So I explained it briefly before. I can go into more depth without boring you with the listeners. But yeah, so Q method is this mixed methods approach. It combines qualitative and quantitative analysis. What you do as a Q method researcher is you attend a neutral space, such as a university campus. That's where I'm going to conduct these studies. So I'll go to a university campus. We can use, well, let's just say I go to neighboring London School of Economics and I just go there. So I go to LSE, I situate myself at the campus at a crossroads where a lot of traffic is. And I will just randomly ask people if they would like to participate in the study, give them a consent form. They will understand the study in full, and then they will come sit in this room with me. I'll be sitting there, not really mentioning anything or doing anything to interfere with their process of sorting. They'll take these 43 statements that are called the Q concourse, and the Q concourse of these 43 statements, they're supposed to reflect and represent the entirety of the debate in everyday terms, not academic ivory tower language, but everyday terms about Brexit, English identity, and European identity. And the participant will sort these statements from most degree to least degree in columns. And at the polls, so at most degree and least degree, there will only be 3 spaces. And every column you go in towards the center, there will be 1 more space to put a statement in. And at the end, this assortment of 43 statements, because every statement has to go on the board, will then reflect their opinion, their subjective interpretation of the issue at hand. So that's the qualitative dimension to the study. And then after that, I will take their Q sort, which is again those 43 statements and how they've arranged them. I will take that Q sort and I will individually input each statement into a software, and the software will then calibrate everything from one statement to another statement to another statement, sorry, not statement, Q sort, and compare them from each participant at the end of the study. And then hopefully there'll be some correlations between certain arrangements of these statements, and then those correlations will in turn form, or at least hopefully form, more broadly held beliefs and opinions on English identity and European identity within England. And from there, I can then analyze what statements kind of aligned and represent one thing, what statements aligned in another place and represent something else, and draw on that. So you could have, let's say there's a statement that says, I feel that England should belong to the English, and someone put that in their most agree column. And then there was another statement that said leaving the EU was a bad thing, and that was in their most disagree statement. And if you found two people who organized their statements exactly like that, and the other 43 statements were relatively similar too, those two broader Q sorts probably represent a Brexiter, a vehement Brexiter who really wanted to leave the EU at all costs and didn't care about any deal. So then I could take those two, maybe three, maybe four different Q sorts that kind of had similar arrangements and say, okay, so this is one opinion that we can see in the UK or in England. And this opinion is a hard Brexiter who believes that European identity and English identity are completely diametrically opposed to one another and completely incompatible and would never be compatible. So that's the quantitative aspect of it. And then in my analysis, I look at the stats behind it, but I also look at the qualitative dimensions. So again, it's mixed methods, which is, I think, a good thing because you get the best of both worlds, and then you can always just address the shortcomings of one with the strengths of the other.
In terms of sample size, right? Have you got a figure in mind? So you're like, I have to get 1,000 people, and it doesn't matter if I have to stand on the street for 24 hours a day, 6 weeks of the year, I have to get these 1,000 people. Have you got a target? Have you got a certain demographic, or is it you'll hit a level and you'll just know?
So the good thing about Q method is, and I guess also a bad thing, but for the context of a 4-year PhD, the good thing is that it only provides, or is only supposed to provide, a snapshot. It's not supposed to look at a long-standing kind of history or something it's like very temporally based. So I don't have to later go, I could obviously expand on the research I'm doing now in a postdoc or a PhD if I even get the PhD in the first place, knock on wood. But yeah, at the end of it, I can build upon what I've learned from the study, but it is supposed to paint a picture, but a snapshot picture. So I don't need to canvass 1,000 people. Methodologically, I've said that I will be looking at the 9 former European parliamentary constituencies within England, because again, I'm looking at European identity, and there's much variance between the regions and how they voted in Brexit, but also just Eurobarometer statistics indicate different beliefs and opinions held within each of the regions. So that was one of the justifications I had for picking those 9 places. I'm going to university campuses specifically, because university campuses is where you'll find the new identifiers. So this next generation of people who will be coming able to vote or already able to vote, but will be the new Europeans or the new English. Like this, because we know Brexit was very much so a decision made by not elderly people, the older generations, right? So now as we see new generations coming into positions of power, finishing their education and stuff, this is where the future of England and the future of the UK EU or UK European relationship lie. So I'm interested in the new identifiers, as I've coined the term. And or maybe I've not coined that, but you can quote me on it. New identifiers is how I'm referring to them. So I'm looking at university students. I'm also interested in looking at people from university campuses. They could be workers who are just there for the day. They could be people who like academic staff. They could be custodial workers. It doesn't really matter. But the primary focus is university students. And I don't think there will be much of an issue with regards to demographic data, because age is not so much as an important factor as is their actual opinion, right? So we're looking at the opinions, not the individual perceptions of a specific person, because we're pooling the Q sorts together to exemplify more broadly held beliefs. The only 2 caveats I have for finding participants and having them able to participate in the study, the one is that they were born in England, so I can't interview people or have people conduct Q sorts if they're not English, because they wouldn't have been able to vote in the referendum, or they wouldn't be able to vote in future referendums, and they wouldn't really have this English identity in the first place, right, if they weren't born in England. And the second caveat is that they must have been able to vote in the Brexit referendum when it was conducted. So they must have been 18 years of age at the point of the Brexit referendum.
Perfect. Okay. And regarding these new identifiers, as you've coined it, they attend universities in the West, naturally, in the UK, most likely. And universities in the West in general have been called out or even criticized for being overly liberal, which would insinuate that perhaps university students and younger people would be opposed to Brexit. Do you believe that that could skew your stats in any way, shape, or form?
Such a great point. I'm so glad you brought it up as well because I actually forgot to mention quite an important caveat, but I'm not looking at just universities. So I'm going to tertiary education institutions. So universities is way too specific. I'm actually going to vocational colleges as well as adult education centers, and even like the Royal Agricultural University. So within each of the former European Parliament constituencies, I'm going to two separate institutions within each for a total of 18. Um, Good example, I'm going to, or I hope to go to either UCL or Imperial in London, and also the London Vocational College. So you'll have representation from both like the more, let's say, working class or everyday, and then you'll have the more ivory tower academia. And then hopefully there'll be people who represent the in-between. So everyday like workers who are walking by and I ask to participate and they're interested in the study, or they participate anyways just because they feel so inclined. So there will be representation, and I have accounted for that. It won't just be this ivory tower academia. And again, you said like this liberal understanding. I think it'll be a bit more broad and hopefully encompass more opinion than just that by nature of who I'm or where I'm going.
And how far along are you within the research? How long will it take until it is completed in your estimation?
So I'm in my third year now of the PhD of four. The fourth year will be a write-up year. So right now I've passed my upgrade. I've done all my preliminary chapter writing. So I've got my literature review. I've got a historical overview chapter of the UK EU relationship with a focus on English identity. And I also have the introduction chapter written, so probably around 40,000 words, give or take. I'm currently working on my methods chapter and theoretical chapter as I will be doing the field work because they'll almost grow symbiotically. I mean, I have like a justification and like layout of everything I will be doing, but I haven't just typed it up yet because there will be some amendments along the way. I think by the time that's done, I'll be about halfway done my dissertation, and then obviously I've got to transcribe and do all the inputting of the data that I collect. So that will take a significant amount of time. I aim to start fieldwork in mid to late February, so this month actually. I'll be doing that until the hope is May, maybe June. I will be canvassing again all the regions I've discussed and the universities there and vocational colleges and institutions of tertiary education. So the hope is to complete it by then, but if I need to go into the summer months more so, I can. I have that flexibility as well. The beauty of it too is that these trips will be quite short to each place, and a lot of the regions quite close to London. So like the Midlands, I could technically do in 2 days, right? I could come back to London. I can go to and fro as well. And I will be saving the trips to, let's say, Newcastle or Liverpool and Manchester until the latter half of my field work. I've done that for two reasons. Firstly, because the closer I am to home base, which is London, the easier it is for me to come back and forth and then maybe make some minor adjustments. And I guess like just learn the tricks of the trade. And then I will also have the support of my supervisors in person, so I can definitely go over things with them more easily. And then as I build that confidence and I have a more established grounding, I can go to further areas that might take a bit more travel, a bit more time, and already have a plan laid out that I've developed while I've been doing the closer regions. So again, the hope is to finish in May or June and then end up being pretty much set for the writing up year, which will be a big undertaking. But if all the data is being, for the most part, processed, it shouldn't be too tough.
You say you've done you're 3 years in, so that sounds like a hell of a lot of work has been done so far. Or you've obviously got a lot more to come. But has anything you've found so far surprised you?
Yeah, definitely with regards to expectations. I came in with an almost completely different project in my research proposal to what I'm actually researching now. I guess the only relationship being the European Union. I think my proposal initially to Professor Fagan and Dr. Foster was something along the lines of studying how a nationalist party are using European Parliament to paradoxically push their own beliefs, but at the same time going against the very institution they're using to do so. And I completely recalibrated to this looking at English identity and European identity and how they're interacting in the post-Brexit political landscape. And I think that's partially because of their recommendations, and I had to hone in on something way more specific than what I initially pitched. But they saw promise in me in my proposal, so they said, you know what, we can definitely work with this, and we have done to a significant extent, and that's why I'm here now. But managing expectations is important too. So I was initially a bit nervous about using Q method because I'd never heard of it before Adam had proposed it, and since then I've become a lot more familiar with it. I've attended a couple workshops, one in Birmingham and then one in Rotterdam in the Netherlands as well. And I've also had opportunities to travel to Oslo, for example, to do this course in the ARENA European Studies department area of the University of Oslo, and I learned about differentiated disintegration in the European Union. So having those opportunities that I didn't think would be thrown my way, it was also just a nice experience to be in these places too. But it was definitely something I didn't anticipate, and I love the freedom of the PhD as well. So I do have to manage my own time and stuff a lot more so than I thought initially. I thought it'd be a bit more structured than it is, but that's the name of the game. So I think I'm probably on track, and those progress reports keep me on my toes. So
Amazing. Thanks very much. I think we will call it a day on part 1. We're going to take a short break and we'll see you all again for part 2.
Okay, Nick, you have officially made it through part 1 of the podcast, which focused on your research. Congrats.
thank you.
Before delving into your PhD experience, we'll have a brief segment that we're yet to title, but it should go as follows. Basically, I'll be briefly outlining 3 pressing news stories or contemporary real-world events that relate to your field of research. I'll then pose some questions to you after detailing each event regarding your thoughts or visions for the future based on these occurrences.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so first of all, former Belgian Prime Minister Verhofstadt went on record recently claiming that Brexit may have somehow incentivized or at least contributed to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. He said that a, quote, united Europe, certainly on defense matters, would make an enormous difference, unquote, insinuating that Brexit created division in Europe, which may have led to the Russian invasion. With that being said, do you believe that Brexit has not only fractionalized European identity, but also the stability of European politics?
So interestingly enough, and I mean coincidentally too, I was just at a talk earlier today. Michel Barnier of the EU, so the European Commission, was just chief negotiator for the EU in the Brexit deal or lack thereof. I mean, there was a deal, obviously, in the end it culminated in a somewhat anticlimactic deal, but yeah, he was discussing this very topic, and he said that Brexit has not served to undermine European identity or fractionalize it, but actually solidified, if not reinforced it, by having a consolidated effort from all EU parties, so EU member states, and having that consolidated plan of action, course of action, and deal with the UK be supported by them, right? So I think there's solidarity there. And I think also that having one of the most reluctant, controversial members, let's say, of the UK leaving the EU, it might streamline and make things easier for them to enact policy that they otherwise wouldn't have. So I'm not sure it'll be a catalyst for complete utter unity and, I mean, a clean and easy path forward for the EU, but it does remove some obstacles by way of leaving, let's say, interesting, if not controversial, again, members of European Parliament out, like Farage and UKIP and the Brexit Party, right? Like those issues will no longer manifest themselves. So it might bring stability to the EU. Also, because the Conservative Party, I guess, at least now has a more unified outlook now that Brexit has happened, maybe it'll bring more peace of mind to the Conservative Party here in the UK. And then that will leave the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats and Labour to fight it out amongst themselves. And maybe that will bring, I guess, a more solid path forward for British politics too. And that's something that could or could not happen, because obviously we know how turbulent the British political landscape is right now. In terms of maybe giving an incentive for Putin to attack Ukraine, I'm not so sure. I think that might be reaching a little bit, because no matter what, the American involvement in European defense is still there, and the UK is still the foremost ally of the European Union. So I think it'd be pretty far-fetched to say that, you see Putin recognizing that the EU is at a weak point now because of Brexit, or they're distracted, so it'd be a good time to invade sorry, not a member, but a nearby state. Like, that just seems quite problematic to view it that way. And also, I think that points a lot of fingers at the UK, if not blaming them for the war in Ukraine, but at least maybe pointing some blame. I think that's unfair. I think the UK is still a huge security partner for the European Union, and I think if anything, the British presence and having the Brexit referendum and everything else amount to a deal does signify that there is still some form of at least cordial relationship between the two parties. So I don't think that would have been an incentive for Putin to invade Ukraine. I think further conflicts, though, could arise. I think there is a potential for other nationalist movements to be fomented in other member states. I think there is an impetus maybe for some people to question the trajectory of European integration. I think that might lead, the Brexit might be a talking point for quite a while. And it's probably not as significant as people think anymore because there's so many issues in the world. But I think there still will be discussions of, oh, well, if Britain did it, maybe Greece can do it with a Grexit. Maybe Denmark will finally, as the UK has done, leave because they've always had this kind of, I don't know, awkward relationship with the European Union and the European Union. And there's been referenda in Ireland, France, and Denmark as well, Netherlands too, at various points in history on EU membership or EU policy and ratification of treaties like Maastricht and stuff. So you never know. I don't want to speculate too much because I am only a lowly PhD student and not yet a bona fide professor or researcher. So.
Okay, perfect. On to the second real world event. A new analysis by Bloomberg Economics estimates that Brexit is costing Britain's economy £100 billion a year. In what light do you view reports such as those that aim to highlight the negative implications of Brexit in the context of European identity in England? And do you foresee a rise in the embrace of European identity within England as a result of figures that frame Brexit in that light as a counter response of sorts?
I mean, a figure like £100 billion is always worrying, but I don't want to suggest it's clickbait because I think that's a dangerous turn of phrase. But I think, yeah, the big money figures in headlines do generate interest and views, right? So, I mean, that could be completely accurate. Bloomberg could estimate, and that estimate could be right. And I do think that Brexit was, for the most part, the UK shooting itself in the foot with, in terms of economics, right? Like there's been multiple indices multiple indices that indicate that Brexit has economically harmed the UK more so than the European Union, but it also did affect the EU negatively too, right? So there's a double-edged sword where both parties have become worse off in a way. So the EU's lost one of their most powerful, I mean, still awkward, but most powerful member states, and the UK is now isolated from the continent, not only geographically, but also politically and economically. There's obviously a working relationship, like I just discussed in the previous answer to the question that you posed. But I don't think sensationalist headlines do much justice to the much more convoluted and complex subject at hand. I would like to see the figures behind that statement, but again, they could be accurate. I don't know enough about that figure to really answer it more so than I just have. But yeah, it is a negative implication, right? The economic damage to both parties is definitely a negative, and we'll see what the UK government can build with other parties. So again, like maybe embracing the Commonwealth to a greater extent than they already do, and making a new multilateral trading agreement on WTO terms with preferential treatment to a certain extent. Who knows, right? It's very forward thinking, but there were promises of that by Boris Johnson and other party members of the Conservatives who were looking for a global Britain as opposed to a European Britain. So we'll see, and we'll see if the Conservatives even remain in office, given the polling and stuff indicates they might not for the next election cycle, right? So another thing to think about.
Perfect. And this might be a bit left field, a bit of a tangent, but just to pick your brain, how do you see the state of English European relations in contrast to countries such as Hungary and Poland, which have been keeping one another in the EU for a long time, even though there are other countries within the EU that would not like for Hungary and Poland to remain within it? How do you compare the English European relations to the relations of member states like Hungary and Poland that are not fully accepted within the EU?
That's a interesting question. I think there's this unfortunately, and for better or for worse as well, this issue of Western Europe versus Eastern Europe. And I think the UK is an anomaly in the Western European context because they were, as Denmark, but the rest of the countries were pretty much on board with the European project from the get-go. Obviously, there's been referenda and other issues that have been raised domestically, but the general political elite of the founding members and the expansion members, like the Benelux countries, Germany and France and whatnot, they were always pretty accepting of the project and where it was going, right? The UK and Denmark were the outliers, and then obviously Switzerland, Norway, and Luxembourg, things like that too, right? But the the trajectory of the European Union suited the Western countries, and they have more of an emotional attachment, I would say, to Europeanness and European identity and the prevention of war, because of World War I and World War II, the notion of containing Germany, but also making sure that Germany remains interested in Europe because they're obviously the strongest country economically. The French being interested in, again, containing Germany, but also having being not as economically as powerful as Germany, but realizing that and also being an able partner, a willing partner with Germany. The UK, again, a bit different because they're a small island, but they have, I say they, I mean, I'm here now, so we as well, let's say, but we have this different empire complex and things like that too. So there was always less of an emotional attachment to European identity, I think, compared to the continent, because I think Tome said geography comes before history, and I'm not sure I completely agree with that, but it is an interesting statement to think about. The Eastern countries, right? They were formerly of the USSR. They have a different, let's say, upbringing, right? They had communist regime. They were satellites, right? They were completely at the whim of the centralized government in the USSR, now Russia. So that different nurture, let's say, compared to nature, has led to maybe a different trajectory, and because of that they're seen as less compatible with the Western European countries, and they're not awkward partners, but a lot of the recent stuff coming out with like laws that in Hungary and Poland that are seen to be anti-LGBTQ plus or anti-women's rights and stuff in the case of abortion, they contravene the fundamental principles of this, I guess, Western-centric notion of European identity. And I think that in order for the EU to remain a composite organism, political organism that can keep going at the pace it is, they do need to reconcile those differences, whether that be recognizing differences or whether that be saying, no, you're out if you keep following that path. Again, another thing to think about, right? I can't postulate more than that, but there do seem to be some issues between, I guess, the West and East that need to be reconciled in some way or another.
Finally, to bring it a bit closer to home, let's discuss Northern Ireland. So the UK and EU have recently finalized a deal in regard to the Northern Ireland issue. Goods flowing between Britain and Northern Ireland were being stopped by the EU for customs checks as they passed through the Republic of Ireland, which is, of course, an EU member. Under the New Deal, goods destined for Northern Ireland would be allowed in without routine checks, while those ultimately destined for the Republic would undergo customs checks at Northern Ireland ports. However, under the reported terms of the deal, the EU and UK will negotiate a separate long-term agreement covering the export of meat, live animals, and other products to Northern Ireland. So, due to the aforementioned further negotiation, experts are predicting that Rishi Sunak will struggle to sell the deal to Brexiteers within his own Conservative Party. I know it's been very long, but with all that being said, does this suggest that fractionalization of European identity in post-Brexit UK is as pervasive in government as it is for us as the general public? And what implications could this have for further deals between the UK and EU moving forward?
I think hardline Eurosceptics that remain in the Conservative Party and haven't defected to other more fundamentally Brexit parties, such as like the Brexit Party of UKIP, which almost seem to have lost their purpose now that they've achieved their mandate. I think Sunak might struggle because it'll look as if to the Eurosceptic members of his caucus, at least, that the EU is still controlling and dictating terms. And I think the Northern Ireland question is fundamentally about peace more so than anything else. I think economics, trade, they come secondary. I think making sure that troubles don't reignite is definitely a more important thing to consider than any of the other things that you've mentioned. The economic aspect of it does feed into identity in the sense that an aspect of sovereignty is controlling one's destiny with regards to economic performance. But I think in terms of the political cultural identity, which is where my research is more aligned with, I think that there is a potential possibly for reunited Ireland, let's say, But I also think that you have to appease a lot of the people in Northern Ireland who want to remain a part of the UK. So Brexit has complicated this matter more so than it ever needed to be, because the Good Friday Agreement definitely helped, I mean, achieve stable and lasting peace, as we've seen, right? It's been evidence over history now. So we'll see where that leads with regards to with the Irish question, let's say. But yeah, I think Brexit has been pervasive in British politics as much as it's been pervasive in terms of the Brexit identities within the population at large. So I don't know where the individually held beliefs between every single member of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and whatnot. I think the Labour Party is kind of, at least now, consolidated its outward belief and projection that they are accepting Brexit and moving forward with Brexit, not going to start applying for another referendum to be had and held with the British populace. I think that the Brexit deal has been signed and done. I think the Liberal Democrats, at least my understanding, is that they still believe a second referendum could be held, and I think the Conservatives are aligned more so with Labour, right? So I think people are moving on now, and I think Brexit is less of a partisan issue in Parliament, and I think it's less of an issue within political parties themselves. I think now it's more so less of an issue with the general population too. I think people are slowly moving on because we're not distant from Brexit, but it has been quite a significant amount of time since Brexit happened, and both the actual leaving of the EU and the initial referendum vote, which was so divisive, right? In terms of implications for further deals between the UK and EU, I think there's always going to be a bit of antagonism between the two parties because the UK left the club. And I think that the EU also needs the UK. They need them as a trading partner. They need them as an ally militarily. I think the UK-EU relationship has the potential, and I think will always still be good and still be the UK will still be a preferred partner compared to other countries because there is that history, there's that legacy, and like it or not, I think the UK is a part of of Europe, not the EU. Sorry, I stumbled there myself, but yeah, that's the question I'm asking. So, but yeah, I think the UK is a part of Europe, and because of the nature of geography and history, will always be considered a part of Europe. So they need to ally themselves, and both parties, I think, need to let it go. And who knows, maybe the UK, with this new identifier generation down the line, 50 years down the line, will apply to the EU if the EU hasn't dissolved. And conversely, if the EU does self-destruct, then maybe we'll see the return of sovereign states within the political landscape of Europe and the political geography of Europe. Who's to say?
Yeah, and then that's exactly what I find so interesting about your research is that it's not so much focused on Brexit itself, but the legacy that it leaves behind and what life will look like in England in a post Brexit world. So yeah, thank you. Great stuff. That's it for the news segment. I hope that you enjoyed it, as well as the listeners, of course. You've left them with a lot to think about. Thank you for your insights. Now, on to the second part of the podcast, in which we will be pivoting away from your research and discussing the PhD experience itself and how you found it.
And welcome back, everyone, to the second part of today's podcast. In the first half, as you'll remember, we focused on Nick's research specifically, but in this second half, we're going to be looking more at the PhD experience on a personal level, looking for Nick's insights and his reflections. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Yahya for the first question.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Nick, not to assume, but you look very young, and it is not so common to see a man as young as yourself pursuing a PhD. So I was just wondering what attracted you to take on this challenge?
I think the PhD lured me, let's say, because I like the idea of the freedom and the ability to research whatever one's interests are professionally. I think it also allows me to prolong my student life. So having that freedom in terms of maybe not going to the office on Monday and holding myself accountable for things, which I've always been quite good at. So I don't really have the procrastination gene in me and things like that, which has allowed me to stay on track, but also appreciate the luxury of having, again, no one really to report to other than my supervisors, but only like weekly or bi-weekly, even things like that. I moved to the UK from Canada. I think you can tell by my accent that I'm not originally from here because I've got family lineage from here. My dad was born in London, my mom in Edinburgh. So I grew up in predominantly English, but also Scottish, as my mom would hate to hear predominantly English. But yeah, it was more of an English household. in Canada. So I kind of felt like it'd be nice to come back to the motherland, the homeland, whatever, and rekindle my roots here. Tottenham are located in London as well. I'm a massive Spurs supporter, so it was always nice coming and being able to watch matches live in person. I know Dan will be like shaking his head because he's an Arsenal lad, but and then both my parents are actually academics too. So I think I have that gene in the family. And they encourage me to pursue the PhD. I don't think they necessarily want me to go into academia because the market for jobs is so competitive and saturated with, I mean, many qualified and capable candidates who also deserve work, right? So I think I'm not so sure if I'll pursue academia. Right now, I'm leaning towards it still because I love the idea of being a professor and teaching. I absolutely love teaching and I love researching. But who's to say? I might go private first, then public, public, then private. Who knows, really? There's a lot out there, and I think the PhD just lets you or enables you to actualize your potential, especially if you're really interested in something such as Brexit and identity politics, which I am.
Okay, so when you were doing your masters, you would have had a set of expectations, maybe, or things you were thinking about would happen during your PhD. How was that matched up to the reality there? Has there been things that that you haven't expected, or you've discovered that have been better than you expected?
Yeah, I think so the master's structure in Canada was 3 semesters in total. The first two being coursework, so you would take 3 courses per semester. They were very, very focused courses. So an example would be nationalism studies in the context of Eastern Europe and Eurasia or something like that. And so you'd pick your modules when you enrolled in the master's program. You do those 6, and then you'd write a dissertation at the end of the final semester. And that dissertation was, I think, 30,000 words, so a decent body of work. Nothing like a PhD thesis, but still quite significant. So that structure was there a lot more than in the PhD. The PhD, you're free reign, really. You do whatever you want so long as you keep filling out your progress reports and keep having them approved and follow the track that you've set out for yourself along with the advice and supervision of your supervisors. I don't think I was anticipating as much freedom as I have. Thought I'd be more structured in terms of checking in every week with a mandatory meeting and a lot more accountability that the institution would have, right? And I again don't need it myself because I'm quite good at holding myself accountable and making pretty good decisions with that respect. I also go into the office every day and treat it as a 9 to 5, which I think was one of the best pieces of advice I received upon starting the PhD. If you treat it like an everyday 9 to 5 job, then you will get it done because you'll be in the office, you'll be working with like-minded people around you. There's that solidarity in the community. In the office, you have lunch. There is structure for you there just by the daily schedule and getting into routine. And I think that was fundamental in at least my experience with getting things done in a timely manner and keeping myself in check. I think the best thing that I've discovered from the PhD is how both casual and professional at the same time my relationship is with my supervisors. So the guidance is amazing. It's helped me so much and they've been great to work with, but also they're just a couple of great lads who, like, we have a WhatsApp chat. We get pints every couple of weeks after we have a formal PhD meeting that's put into the institution website to say we've met and things like that. So I think advice, I guess, for prospective PhDs is like they treat you, at least supervisors treat you like an actual academic, and it's not something to be nervous about as much as you can help it. It's less formal than you think. And I also thought that I'd have to go into the office every day in a tweed blazer and some nice trousers and whatnot and dress shoes. But instead, everyone's coming in casual. They're ready to work. But it's a lot more of a community than you'd expect. And I think maybe I've been lucky that my workplace environment in the King's office in Bush House is exceptional. And maybe even my supervisor relationship with Adam and Russell is also exceptional. But I wouldn't have it any other way than I have it now. Like, it's really been such a welcome surprise.
On to kind of the stuff that's helped you, let's not say cope to make it sound like it's this horrible thing, but what's helped you throughout the process kind of maintain your focus? Has there been any particular thing or hobby or anything that's helped you kind of balance that work life, just that work life balance? How have you gotten that on point within your experience?
So there's multiple things that have helped me with that. I think the structuring my day as like the 9 to 5, as I was discussing previously. So getting up quite early, I think for most people, like I get up at 6:30, head to the gym or the pool or go for a run, get my hour in of fitness that day. Helps me relax and cope with stress, get that endorphin rush as well. Head to the office, read the news in the morning and just catch up on affairs, look at Spurs news to see if we've been linked with any transfers or how poorly we're going to do in the next match, things like that. See if anyone thinks we're going to win a trophy this year. After that, yeah, I think having the schedule with not only myself, but having this office group chat on WhatsApp as well, where we keep each other in check. People will say in the morning, "Hey, who's coming into office?" When I see 2 or 3 people respond, I know I'm probably already going in, but that just reaffirms that in my head. Like, oh, look, I know I'm gonna have someone to chat to, someone to kind of distill the day with, and like make sure it's not just me sitting at a computer mindlessly typing for hours on end with no personal interaction or communication. So having that supportive community has definitely helped. I think we've also made it so people want to go into the office. Like we're excited to have lunch with each other and catch up with each other. I'm even hosting a PhD gathering, like it's a bit delayed, but a New Year gathering at my house on Friday to get people from the department involved, extracurricularly, let's say. So things, yeah, things like that too. And again, maybe it's luck of the draw, and maybe some people's offices aren't like that, but I am super fortunate that mine is. Another way that I do, I guess, cope, as you put it, or it's something that's helped me with keeping myself in check and keeping the time structured, let's say, is just making sure I have a good working relationship with my supervisors and scheduling meetings periodically, but enough that it feels consistent. So 2 weeks, maybe sometimes 3 weeks, but at least monthly, if not twice, 3 times a month sometimes, if there's something pressing or something I'm working towards. But emailing once a day or once every 2 days as well, just to check in. It could just be a hi. It could even be a text saying, how are things going? Or getting a pint after work, anything like that. But eventually you'll have that relationship with your supervisors where you feel comfortable enough to message them. Maybe it's not getting a pint, maybe they don't drink, maybe you don't feel comfortable or you don't drink yourself, but getting coffee, anything like that, right? It's important to have that relationship with them. And I think being more personal and having that ability to communicate definitely reinforces your sense of belonging and that you don't have like you're not an imposter. And everyone will suffer from imposter syndrome in the PhD. I think it's inevitability, but it's that relationship with my supervisors and my PhD cohort that makes me feel like I belong and that what I'm doing is worthwhile.
So you touched briefly there on imposter syndrome. Is that the primary challenge about the whole process? Are there other challenges, things that have occurred to you that have been particularly difficult along the way?
Imposter syndrome is a big one, I think, initially, but now that I have a decent amount of work written out and I'm starting field work, I have less imposter syndrome than I once did. And I think that imposter syndrome will come back when I begin the writing up period, when I'm completely overwhelmed by all the data and all the writing I have to do. But then that'll probably dissipate again. And so it comes in ebbs and flows. Managing time was initially quite difficult as well because there's so much free time on my hands. But I used COVID in a positive way in the sense that I started out with no real social interactions for quite a while, in a new city, and there was nothing really much open to do anyways. So I did spend a lot of time writing and researching. So I've got, I think, like 400 pages of Microsoft Word documents of notes, that can just, and with citations, like in-depth citations, page numbers and everything ready to cite and incorporate or at least reference, in my own head. And I think COVID was a blessing only in that sense, really, but I'm more prepared because of it. So I did use that time wisely as opposed to watching 3 movies a day and sleeping 12 to 14 hours, which I did at times too. Of course, I'm not perfect and I'm not a robot, but I did use that time well, and then that's also allowed me to have more fun and free time in this current moment. So I'm able to take 4-day work weeks from time to time, which I did a lot in the summer as well, because I would go away for the weekend, or I would just end up spending time in the sun and like relishing those social interactions that I didn't have for a year and a half. So it's allowed me to do that. So I think if you really persevere and get quite a bit done initially, or at least keep yourself in check, you can definitely achieve that balance. But achieving that balance is quite hard, and I know some people struggle with it more than others. Another challenge that I've faced is just really honing in on something. Like you come in with all these great ideas, and it's not that your wings are clipped, but you do have to really condense and solidify a specific thing to research. And PhDs are way more focused than I thought they were. Like I thought PhDs were pretty big projects that touched on numerous things were essentially glorified literature reviews, but instead they're unique little tiny tidbits of adding to the existing literature, but they're real in the sense that you conduct your own work. And in my master's, I didn't do any of my own primary field work. I did a lot of referencing, consulted historical documents and stuff like that, but I didn't go out into the field. Like I looked at party manifestos and stuff like that too, and consulted Eurobarometer statistics and things like that. But actually meeting people day to day and saying, "Hey, I'm a PhD researcher. Are you interested in participating in the study?" Like that's a different kettle of fish. So I'm excited about it, but I'm also nervous because I do find it daunting because it's the first time I've done it. So I can report back in a later podcast and tell you how it's going.
And would you say that these 3 years of your PhD research have been the most difficult stage in your academic/professional career?
Yeah, I think the first year was especially difficult because of COVID. So moving to London during COVID, having family members here, luckily, which a lot of people, if they did move during that year, wouldn't even have in the first place. So I was lucky with that compared to others. But having or not having the ability to meet my supervisors in person, living on my own in a small student accommodation apartment that King's supplied was yeah, it was isolating socially, left to your own thoughts a lot, like not in a very nihilistic or weird way, but just like sitting alone. And because you can't just bounce things off a colleague sitting behind you at their desk or something like that, you get caught up and you get kind of lost and you start saying, oh, maybe I should address this bit of the research here. And then you find something completely new that's just been published and you think, oh shit, someone else has just written a paper that is essentially my thesis. So am I plagiarizing? Am I not presenting anything new or like anything revolutionary? And yeah, that was definitely tough that first year, and I think as things have become more laid back with regards to COVID, it's become easier. But the PhD has definitely been the hardest part of my academic career. I think the master's was the easiest, and I think the first couple years to undergrad were significantly easier than the latter two of the 4 years, because in Canada it's a 4-year program of your undergrad, if you specialize, which the majority of people in arts and humanities do. So the fourth year of undergrad, I say, was a lot harder than the year of my master's.
And with that being said, what advice would you give someone thinking about applying for a PhD?
Yeah, I would definitely say reach out to prospective supervisors before you even develop a full application. So if you develop a research project, hopefully loosely based on your master's project, because that saves you time and also you're a bit more grounded in that discipline or that area of study, and then you have a bit more to bring to the table when contacting potential supervisors. I think you should reach out first, and get those connections, utilize any connections you have from your master's as well, and talk to other PhDs, or people who already have their PhDs, because they'll give you some insight into what it really is like to be a PhD student or PhD researcher. I didn't know that the PhD system, I mean, I had both my parents are professors, right? So I had a lot of easy conversations with them as opposed to having to message people out of the blue and stuff like that. But my parents were very helpful in that respect, and they said, yeah, you need to definitely message supervisors or people with shared interests with you before you even start developing these vast applications, because you could waste so much time developing the best application ever, but then find out no one is suitable to research your research project in that institution, or at least they're not available. Like I was rejected, and rejection is another big thing you have to deal with, from quite a university, simply because people were on sabbatical and I wanted to start when I wanted to start. I didn't want to defer for a year. Um, like I was rejected by St. Andrews is a good example, just because they couldn't find someone to supervise me, even though they were interested in my project. I was rejected by LSE, I think, for the same reason, things like that, right? So you do have to take into account that things aren't as easily aligned. Like it's not just you're accepted and there you go. You have to actually have a relationship with a supervisor, or for the most part too in the UK, I think it's you always have to have a secondary supervisor. So you have to have two people who are grounded in your discipline, know what's going on with your project, have an interest in supervising your project, and can supervise your project. So that was definitely something I would advise before people start developing these huge applications with no supervisors lined up. Another thing is also university rankings are very important, but you also pay attention to departmental rankings. So it's not just like the university's reputation, but the department as well. So you could go to the best university in the world, like Harvard or Oxford or something like that. but their politics and economics department or their politics department or their IR department, whatever it is, might not be as ranked as highly as the university itself. So there are differences between the two, and those should be looked at as well, because it is important to go to a name brand university, and King's luckily is one of those as well. But also King's, like the School of Politics and Economics, is one of the most revered in the world as well. So like there's hitting both nails on the head there, right? Not to gas up King's too much, but I'm very happy to be here. So, and it is definitely a privilege and a responsibility as well to do the institution well for accepting me and having belief in me, right? And also my supervisors.
So for my last question, I was going to ask you what the PhD community is like, but it sounds like it's all pints and parties and WhatsApp groups. It sounds like you're having a blast. Like, is that, in serious note, is that a fair reflection? How important is that community and that support to what you do?
Well, I mean, it is quite unique, I think, and I've said that a few times, that our office is so close. But it all started with myself, two of my colleagues, Lena and Henry, joining the PhD program in COVID. We had, I think, 1 or 2 drinks before everything shut down for a lockdown, and then we were in lockdown for 6 months. But because we all lived on our own, we were able to see each other because of that rule. So we would go and see each other, and we developed a WhatsApp chat just for the three of us. But then when we moved into the office the second year, Kings had opened up, so more and more people were coming to the office. And then we decided to just have this office chat and kept adding people, and somehow everyone just became friends, and we all just agreed to be friends. I think well, I mean, it happened naturally. We didn't agree and sign like a document or anything like that. But yeah, like it unfurled naturally, and it's still to this day a bit of a, not a surprise, but more of a luck of the draw thing. And that support network we have in the office is quite unique and very important to me, and I think important to most of the people in the office too. At times it does become distracting though, so that is a warning. If you are mates with everyone in your office, you get less work done. But that also is an accountability thing for yourself too. So if you need to get things done, you could stay home. You could also book a meeting room, or you can just put on headphones and really hunker down. And people do that. And we kind of can read the room too. So if we see someone is reading, or because we're all close and we know people have deadlines, we will recognize that, and we will then cater to those things that are going on. So like a couple of my friends in the office recently applied to the list DTP scholarship, and we're all aware of the deadlines, so we kept office noise to a minimum. And then the moment they both submitted on the Friday of last week, we celebrated and got drinks, right? So it's important to have those relationships, and I think office politics and in any setting really, but in our setting, are still important. So you do have to be wary of what you're saying, who you're saying it to, things like that. But if you can develop a community with like-minded and shared interests, supportive, recognizing of differences in background, and upbringing, everything like that as well, then you're going to have a great time no matter what. And I think friendships are what you make of them, or working relationships are what you make of them, and hopefully they turn into friendships. Like I can safely say that some of my best friends in London are sitting in office with me, right? Like, and that's such a great thing to be able to say, and something that I didn't anticipate at all. But it's not all pints, though there are a lot of pints.
Important clarification. Thank you. Thank you for that. And that brings an end to today's episode. I'd like to thank my co-host for today, Yahya, for his support. And I'd like to also thank Nick for sharing his thoughts and insights. Of course, thanks also to you, our listeners, for taking the time to tune in. And we look forward to welcoming you again soon for our next episode. Take care.